combined ground offensive from various fronts, coupled with a combined missile.
Iranian professor Mohammad Marandi has criticized Israel for its double standards in addressing the long-standing Palestinian crisis, from the Oslo Accords to the wars in Lebanon, and Israel's portrayal of Iran as an enemy. Marandi's remarks came in response to a video clip where the Israeli Prime Minister alleged that Iran was waiting for the right moment to invade and dominate the Middle East.
But we have to deal with the Axis. The Axis doesn't threaten only us, it threatens you. It's on the march to conquer the Middle East. Conquer the Middle East. Conquer. That means actually conquer. Conquer Saudi Arabia, conquer the Arabian Peninsula. It's just a question of time.
According to Marandi, these fears propagated by Israel are a strategy to keep the Arab world on edge, prevent unity on the Palestinian issue, and maintain Israeli dominance in the region. This observation aligns with what many analysts describe as fear-mongering, aimed at garnering further collaboration and compliance from authoritarian Arab leaders. The ultimate goal of these fears is to compel Arab leaders to view Iran's genuine efforts to support the oppressed Palestinian people, whether politically or militarily, through a politicized lens. Consequently, the Arab League appears unable to bring about a lasting solution to the Palestinian debacle through a united front, whether through diplomacy or other means, to force Israel to end its occupation, land seizures, and settlement building, all of which hinder the emergence of a Palestinian state. Since the entire Arab region has been swayed by Israel's diplomatic charm offensive, Iran stands as the only democracy in the Middle East not lured by Israel's plans to keep the Palestinian issue subdued in its pursuit of a greater Israel, stretching from the river to the sea. Iran has consistently reminded Israel of the refugees it created through the Nakba, and advocated for a viable two-state solution, which Israel has continuously sabotaged. Iran's support for armed resistance has ensured that Israeli occupation forces are frequently challenged. Iran's steadfast support for the Palestinian struggle has made it an adversary not just to Israel, but also to the West. Professor Marandi argues that the attacks on Iran's economic interests and people are not primarily about its nuclear program, but rather its unwavering support for Palestinians. He asserts that the strategic calculations are such that if a force like Iran, which leads the axis of resistance, is neutralized, Israel would proceed to declare its dream of a greater Israel, thereby consigning Palestinian self-determination to the annals of history.
Yes, sure. And I'd just like to add that it's also a fact that the Iranians were supporting other countries that were suffering from U.S. Sanctions and dirty wars. So Iran supported Cuba, but I think most importantly, Iran supported Nicaragua during the dirty war in the 1980s, when the United States was using the Contra rebels, to the right-wing fanatical Contra rebels, to undermine the government in Nicaragua. So it's not just South Africa or South African countries and Palestine. It includes places like Nicaragua and Cuba. But the Iranians, I think it would be fair to say that its military involvement or its support for the military wing of the resistance grew gradually. So, for example, in Lebanon, Hezbollah was created during the Israeli invasion of the country. The Israelis captured half of Lebanon, they captured the capital, and they killed anywhere between 30 and 40,000 people. They carried out the massacre in the Palestinian refugee camp Sabra and Shatila. Between 2,000 to 3,000 people were slaughtered, women and children, in less than 48 hours in that camp by their fascist right-wing allies in Lebanon, but with the support of the Israeli military. It was at that time that Hezbollah was born, and in 1982. And Hezbollah grew during the occupation. And gradually it began to become increasingly powerful, and it forced the Israelis to retreat in phases. And ultimately, in the year 2000, the Israeli regime was forced to retreat from southern Lebanon. So Hezbollah was a national liberation organization, and it was created as a result of Israeli aggression. Also, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, as they grew, because we're speaking about the contemporary situation, they gradually got more support from Iran. And so their capabilities gradually expanded. And what we see today, as you rightly point out, is a war in which the Israelis have failed. So there are two parts to this conflict today. One is the genocide, where the Israeli regime is slaughtering innocent civilians out of revenge because they've lost on the battlefield. And the other is the battlefield, where the Israelis have failed. They have failed to control the northern part of the Gaza Strip. They failed to control the central part of the Gaza Strip, and they failed to control the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And they've also failed in the north against Hezbollah as well. And so the Palestinian capabilities, their military capabilities today, are obviously far greater than they were before. And that is, of course, because of their own innovation, their own courage, but also because of Iranian funding, Iranian support, Iranian technology. And so these tunnels that we see across Gaza and across Lebanon and elsewhere, and in Yemen, these are all with the help, obviously, of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that's why, for example, just hours ago, the Americans bombed a radio station in Al-Hodeidah in Yemen, killing a large number of innocent civilians. They cannot bomb the underground bases of the Yemeni armed forces, or Ansarullah, what they call the Houthis. So the Americans and the British take their revenge on ordinary people or sympathizers. It's the same policy as the Israeli regime in Gaza or in the West Bank or against the Lebanese. But the capabilities that we see today are bearing fruit. The Israelis have lost on the battlefield. There is no escape from this defeat. The longer the war lasts, the worse it is going to get for the regime. Iran will continue to support Hamas. It will continue to support its allies in defending themselves and the people of Palestine, not just in the Gaza Strip, but elsewhere. And the coalition of resistance organizations, or the axis of resistance, they will continue to increase pressure on the Israeli regime to force it to accept a ceasefire. So you're going to see Yemen continue to block ships, and Yemen will continue to enforce the Genocide Convention as they've stated they would. Hezbollah will continue to hit the Israeli regime hard, and it will hit it harder. And the resistance in Iraq and Syria will continue to lob missiles and drones and cause greater damage to the Israeli regime to help decrease pressure on the resistance. But also the resistance in Iraq will make sure that the Americans feel vulnerable so that they refrain from taking further steps in supporting or taking military steps. And that is an understandable position for the West to take as well. In fact, when President Raisi was killed in the helicopter crash, immediately afterwards, there was a lot of talk in the Western media about how Iranians were celebrating and how they were all happy to see him die. And I had a personal experience on the BBC, literally an hour or two after it was stated that he had passed away, I was on the BBC television, and before me they had these two Iranian American women or Canadian women, and they were saying how everyone is celebrating and how everyone is happy, and people online are celebrating. And after spending maybe 10, 15 minutes speaking with these two people, the journalist finally got to me, the person who's actually living in Iran. And I said, from what I've seen on the streets, in conversations on campus, people are very unhappy. They're very sad. And they were very worried until, because it was a few hours before it became clear that the president had indeed passed away. But then I told him that you're going to see funerals in the coming days, and I expect them to be enormous. And when people come to the streets in their millions, what are you going to say about all this narrative building that we've been witnessing and that we are witnessing? And so 3 days later, I think it was 3 days later, on the same show, because it was the same hour, I was again invited on the BBC, and I told them that, I told the host that, 3 days earlier, this is what happened, what I was saying. And look, people on the streets, millions of people in Tehran, millions of people in other cities. Does this look like a country that is celebrating the death of their president? And the problem, therefore, is, and the Western media has gone silent ever since. They shut down the narrative and moved on to the next topic. But the problem that the West has is that they want to believe these things because they want to believe that their adversaries are unpopular, that they're hated, and that the world wants to be like the West. But that isn't necessarily the case. In fact, it definitely isn't true. So this is nothing new. I've been hearing this for decades. In Iran, the Palestinian people have an enormous amount of sympathy. And I think the funerals themselves are reflective of that, because President Raisi was a very, very staunch supporter of the Palestinian cause.
Professor Morandi's assertions revolve around the idea that the US and Israel, rather than solely combating Islamist extremism, have at times exploited these groups to undermine and destabilize their mutual adversaries. This strategy is alleged to have been employed in various conflict zones, including Syria and Libya, where extremist groups have played prominent roles in the chaos and violence that have engulfed these countries. In Syria, for example, the rise of extremist factions amid the civil war has been a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. According to Morandi, the US and its allies have provided tacit or direct support to these groups to weaken the Syrian government, which is seen as an adversary of both American and Israeli interests. This support allegedly includes funding, arms, and intelligence, allowing these extremist groups to maintain and expand their operations in the region. Similarly, in Libya, the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 led to a power vacuum that was quickly filled by various militant groups, including Islamist extremists. Morandi argues that the US intervention, which ostensibly aimed to promote democracy and human rights, in reality facilitated the rise of these factions, leading to prolonged instability and violence. Morandi's analysis suggests that the use of extremist groups as proxies serves multiple strategic purposes for the US and Israel. It helps to fragment and weaken states that are perceived as threats, making them less capable of challenging Western and Israeli dominance in the region. Furthermore, the resultant instability provides a pretext for continued military intervention and presence, justified under the banner of combating terrorism. However, this strategy is fraught with risks and ethical dilemmas. The empowerment of extremist groups can lead to widespread suffering and destruction, as seen in the prolonged conflicts in Syria and Libya. These groups often perpetrate severe human rights abuses, contributing to the humanitarian crises that have displaced millions of people and caused untold suffering. Moreover, the long-term effectiveness of this strategy is questionable. Morandi notes that such tactics have failed to achieve desired outcomes in some cases, such as in Iran. Despite numerous efforts to destabilize the Iranian government, including economic sanctions and covert operations, the country remains a formidable player in the region, suggesting that the policy of using extremist proxies has its limits.
Over the years, the Israeli regime targeted Iranians, and it was basically because they were supporting the Syrian armed forces against the extremist groups that were backed by NATO and these oil-rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region and the Israeli regime. So, for example, alongside the occupied Golan, the occupied Syrian Golan, the Israelis were supporting both ISIS and Al-Qaeda, or Al-Qaeda. Both ISIS and Al-Qaeda had bases alongside the Syrian Golan. And of course, ISIS came out of Al-Qaeda. They were one, and then they split. And also Al-Qaeda, from the very beginning of this dirty war, was working with the Americans. We have the famous email that was exposed by WikiLeaks, where Jake Sullivan tells Hillary Clinton on February the 12th, 2012, that in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. And of course, the same extremist forces were being used in Libya, such as the person who carried out a suicide attack in Manchester. He and his father were working with British intelligence, and they were fighting in Libya. So you have these extremist groups that were working with the West. And so ISIS and Al-Qaeda both had bases alongside the Syrian Golan. And as the Syrian army and their allies would try to defeat them and retake Syrian territory, the Israelis would bomb the Syrians and their allies. They would use helicopter gunships. They would shell them. They would use tank fire. They would treat the terrorists in their hospitals, and they would give them ammunition and food to carry on the fight against the government. And during those years, because Israel wanted to overthrow the Syrian government alongside its partners in NATO and Turkey and Jordan and in the Persian Gulf region, they would target Iranians. But the Iranians did not respond because the Syrian government was in enough trouble as it was, and Iran wanted to keep the focus on Syria. More recently, after October the 7th, when the conflict intensified in Gaza, and Lebanon and Hezbollah joined in the fight to help Gaza, because the Israelis have been forced to keep half of their forces and capabilities in the north, and thus making it much more difficult for them in the fight against Hamas and its allies. The Iranians, of course, were helping the resistance. And so, again, there was a new wave of attacks on Iranian officers. A number of officers were killed, and finally, when the Israeli regime bombed the Iranian consulate, killing a number of officers and a couple of very senior officers, the Iranians decided to respond. I went to the embassy, which I'll get to a bit later. So the Iranians decided to respond because they said that the Israelis have crossed all red lines, and tomorrow they may bomb another embassy or another part of the Iranian embassy in Syria. And this is unprecedented in the world. Never before had an embassy been targeted intentionally, killing so many people before. There was just the case of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, which the Americans claimed that it was an accident, and I think there were 3 Chinese diplomats who were killed. But this was something openly intentional, and the casualties were higher. So in all, I think over the past few months, 19 military officers, including senior officers, were murdered by the Israelis. So after this, the Iranians decided to respond. And they waited a couple of weeks, both because they wanted to carry out psychological warfare, but also there were complicated negotiations going on. Iran wanted to take the issue to the UN Security Council, which they did. And the US, Britain, and France refused to condemn the Israeli regime for bombing the Iranian embassy. And I think that's quite extraordinary. And I think the West really doesn't understand how people across the world and Iranians view the West when they behave in this way. So the Iranians proved to their own people and to the international community, minus the West, but the international community, the global South, the real majority, and increasingly the more powerful part of the international community, they showed them that the true nature of the Israeli regime, and their backers. So ultimately, Iran decided to carry out the attack. Iran announced it beforehand, and there was a reason for that. Iran wanted the United States and its allies, all of them, to combine all of their capabilities. So the Americans brought in everything they had. So did the French, the British, the Israelis, of course. And then the Iranians began launching drones, a significant number of drones, over a bit less than, I think, 200 drones. They were older drones, and they announced it. Basically, they openly declared that they are firing these drones, and the reason was because the Iranians wanted the Israelis and the Americans to engage. For three reasons. One is that the Iranians wanted to deplete the Israeli and the American and the European air defense capabilities. According to some estimates, up to $4 billion of missiles were used, and there were roughly $4 billion, $4 million were spent on air defense that night. $1.35 billion by the Israelis, and the rest by mostly the Americans and the other allies. Whereas the Iranians only spent a few, maybe tens of thousands of dollars, or maybe $100,000 or a bit more on the drones. The second reason was that Iran wanted to gather intelligence about capabilities, both Israeli capabilities, but also American and European capabilities. And the third was that these drones were decoys. They were used to keep the air defenses busy so that the missiles could also be fired. So the Iranians fired when the drones reached near their destinations, and the Israelis and the Americans had to down the drones because they all had payloads. So when they were near their destination, meaning Palestine, the Iranians fired a series of missiles. Now, there are broadly speaking, two types of missiles. One was older model missiles. Again, they were kept in storage for many years. Iran wanted to get rid of them, but also they were cheap, and they forced the Israelis and the Americans again to engage. So it was very expensive for the West, and it also gave more information about their capabilities. And alongside that, the Iranians fired some of their more advanced drones. Their more advanced missiles, not their most advanced missiles, but more advanced missiles. Those missiles, as far as I know, all got through. I've heard friends say that some got through and a couple didn't, but as far as I know, all got through. That's my understanding. So the Iranians hit a military base in the south, which is probably the most protected military air base in the world, where the F-35s were stored, which is used to bomb both Gaza, but also which was used to attack the Iranian embassy. And they also bombed an intelligence base on the Golan, the Syrian Golan, occupied Golan, and damaged that severely as well. So Iran was sending a message to the Israelis and the Americans that we can get through, we can make things very costly for you, and for us it's very inexpensive and very much worth.
The insights provided by Professor Mohammed Marandi reveal a deeply intricate and morally complex geopolitical landscape in the Middle East, one marked by strategic alliances, ideological conflicts, and power plays. Through a critical examination of the alleged use of Islamist extremists by the US and Israel to destabilize adversaries, the use of fear-mongering to maintain regional dominance, and Iran's steadfast support for the Palestinian cause, several profound conclusions can be drawn. First, the strategic use of extremist proxies by Western powers and Israel underscores a significant ethical dilemma. While these tactics may achieve short-term geopolitical objectives, they often lead to long-term instability, human suffering, and widespread destruction, as evidenced by the conflicts in Syria and Libya. The empowerment of such groups perpetuates violence and undermines efforts to achieve lasting peace and stability in the region. Second, Israel's portrayal of Iran as an imminent threat serves as a calculated strategy to prevent Arab unity on the Palestinian issue and secure compliance from authoritarian Arab leaders. This fear-mongering not only diverts attention from Israel's own contentious policies, including settlement expansion and occupation, but also hinders collective Arab efforts to advocate for Palestinian self-determination and rights. This tactic highlights the complex interplay between regional power dynamics and the pursuit of national interests. Third, Iran's unique position as a vocal supporter of Palestinian rights and resistance against Israeli expansionism sets it apart in the Middle Eastern political arena. Despite facing economic sanctions and political isolation, Iran's unwavering commitment to the Palestinian cause challenges the prevailing narratives and exposes the underlying motivations behind the attacks on its sovereignty. Morandi's analysis suggests that Iran's resistance poses a significant obstacle to Israel's vision of a greater Israel, underscoring the broader ideological